What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through why I'm not playing the 10k a month game, how that shapes the vision of Killer Chaos OS, and why this is not the game that I think would be suitable for me long term. So like always with these videos, the main mission is to show our builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of frameworks and meta models, and how we are scaling those into the future. Also to solve what hurts within businesses and organizations, basically to come in, be the chief problem solvers, and ultimately just build back-end infrastructure while doing it. And also ultimately basically to call in visionaries, basically people that are aligned with the mission that we are striving to solve for, which is chaos, and ultimately just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So this is a super fun one. I think this is, what shapes the vision of me internally and both externally to, directly know the path that I'm striving to build for. And just solely just knowing this, I think this is a very important thing to think about, and also just shape the vision of Killer Chaos OS, and also me personally. And right now most people are optimizing for 10k a month, and I just want to start this off with, I have the most utter respect for people that are striving to make 10k a month in every aspect. This is, in my most humble frame, I think this is one of the most best stepping stone that you can make in your journey. But for me, I get that and I respect that a lot, but I'm not chasing that, ultimately not because I don't want money, but ultimately because I'm building something way bigger, and that ultimately is Killer Chaos OS, what it is in the future. And Killer Chaos OS isn't just a business, but rather a operating system for the future, and that takes more than cash flow. I think one of the most important things that I've been super bullish on lately is, not to get trapped into, the mindset of, hey, right now we need to be striving to just make 10k a month and just focus on the short-term cash flow plays, and neglect the long-term plays that ultimately build the vision of Killer Chaos OS. And one thing I like to think about as well when it comes to this is, if you think about all the guys that built Tesla, SpaceX, all these great companies, in the beginning they weren't optimizing for cash. And I think that also brings a sense of, it's okay to not optimize solely for that, but rather optimize for the long future of what it is that we're actively building for in the long term. And I think right now, because I just solely just believe that this is going to be what's going to shape the future of backend operations and systems into the future of saying, hey, how can we actively just re-innovate or just innovate this aspect that I personally feel could use a lot more innovation in, and ultimately drive that. But in order to do that, it also means making certain sacrifices, which is ultimately saying, hey, the vision of what it is that we're actively building for is bigger than chasing those short-term goals, which is make 10k a month and then what's after that. I think just having that long-term vision is one of the things that is ultimately going to serve us, because I believe that there's certain timeless principles in business that ultimately scale through time, basically saying, hey, PayPal and all these other different companies, Nvidia and all these different companies, they didn't take the mindset or the approach of, hey, let's just make 10k a month and then we see what's after that. And I also just want to take that same nuggets as well, if you will, to say, hey, how can we actively just build the future, because they focused on solving problems and then everything else was a byproduct of that. And how can we steal that nugget, or just have this shared vision as well with them as well, to say, hey, we ultimately just want to be solving problems at scale into the future, and right now optimizing for that is not the long-term play that will ultimately guide us in terms of what it is that we're doing. But right now we just solely just need to gather those data points that ultimately drive how we ultimately understand how we're building Killer Chaos OS, which is super important, because we can't architect if we don't spend the time just solely understanding so many aspects. And I had a conversation with someone about this yesterday, where we were talking about just optimizing for the long term. And I think just having those that mindset of exactly what it is that you're building for, and you're not sacrificing the short term for the long term game, you ultimately understand that, hey, we ultimately know that the vision of Killer Chaos OS is what we truly believe in, and I solely believe in solving this big problem. But how can we actively do that? By focusing on the long term and not just compromising the short term future by by, just optimizing, hey, let's just bring in as much cash flow, and then from the cash flow, what do we do? And you can argue with this and say, you can deploy it in many different aspects, which is true, but ultimately just solely just understanding that, hey, we need to make sure that our long-term view, or the way that we want to shape Killer Chaos OS, is going to take time, and that's okay. We just need to understand that, hey, during this time where we're basically building the future for Killer Chaos OS, how can we actively optimize and just get those data points that ultimately allow us to then optimize for the future of what's to come, and say, hey, the payoff, long term is going to be more beneficial than just optimizing for the short term, and that's okay. It's just then begs the question of how can we actively just keep this mindset and not get sidetracked off of this. And I know that, being in the online space and things like that, there is a lot of, noise that comes around that to say, hey, you're not making 10K a month, so you don't have a proven product. But if you look at, the beginnings, the first companies, the PayPal, the Apples, all of those, they didn't optimize, for cash flow like in the 10K a month era that we're in. And for sure, we're in different times, but I think it's just a different operating model for different things that, are being built at the same time. And I think this is true. I fundamentally do believe that this is true, and it takes thought architecture, and it also takes systems thinking, and ultimately that takes time. You can never bypass that, in my opinion, that you can never bypass that time that you need to take in order to build this product. And there's so many things that went into building Apple into these big companies, and we also just want to solve big problems, and ultimately understanding that, hey, the road that we're taking ultimately takes a long time, because we need to get the core of these different principles like systems thinking, first principles, and also design, and also development. We need to just have those super dialed in, and then we can scale that up. But in order to do that, we solely just need to understand that, hey, this is the game that we're playing, and that's okay if we're taking a bit longer, but ultimately the payoff long term is ultimately going to serve the long term vision. And ultimately just doing right by that, I think, is ultimately going to get us closer to our overarching goal and the vision of reshaping industries and inspiring millions of people, which is ultimately what we want to do and ultimately strive for each and every single day. And I know that each and every single day we take, we're going to get a step closer, but in order to do that, it takes time. We can't rush the process, and I don't want to rush the process, because I don't want to be in a position where we are, at this scale, we're just focusing solely on cash, but then the whole machine breaks. I'd rather take the time, build it right, build the solid foundations, and then once we build the solid foundations, then we can take it up a notch, because we've built that foundation of saying, hey, we understand systems thinking at its core, we understand first principles at its core, we understand different project management tools, we understand all these different things, and we can actively be the best in the space, which ultimately will bring all those things that we want in the long term as a byproduct. And solely just by just diving deep in this, I know that we're gonna get a step closer each and every single day, that we just keep hitting the nail in the wall. But it takes time, and I'm sure that all the great builders and people that built great products, they also understood that it takes time, and that's okay. That is that's okay. That's a hit, or that's a pivot that I'm willing to take to make sure that we do it right, and that we also create as much value as we possibly can in the long term, which is a strategic play. But with that, it means 10K a month is a great chapter, but it's not my book. Ultimately understanding that, hey, it is great for certain people, like I respect that a lot, to say, hey, 10K a month, that's good, but that goal is ultimately designed for safety, and I'm designing self-healing infrastructure. A 10K a month mindset builds offers that sell, and ultimately for us, I'm building a company that compounds without me in the room, basically building this compounding machine that goes long term and says, hey, we're going to be pumping out whatever we're going to be pumping out into the future, and we want to create this level of impact. And how can we actively do that? By just creating those B2B services that ultimately allow us to scale our operations into the future. And that means automated workflows, decision making machines, and also advisory boards shaping the product, and also a vision that scales past South Africa and even the greater landscape of how can we actively just build this vision into the machine that we're actively solving for, and also make sure that each and every single day we are building and hitting the nail in the wall. But ultimately that takes time. Even decision making machines, I mean, ChatGPT was not built by ChatGPT, and I think that is somewhat true, that hey, ChatGPT was not built by ChatGPT, and that, you know, I think there are certain business principles and core principles that scale through time in that, to say hey, they didn't build it through ChatGPT, and you know, you can build all these other things because it's, you know, made it more easier and accessible. 100% facts. But what are the, you know, timeless principles within that concept that we can actively steal nuggets from and also scale into the future, which I believe is a super important question to ask. Otherwise, you don't you understand how to basically build the machine, because I think one of the most important things, especially in the time that we're going in, is ultimately understanding how to build the machine, so that when the machine breaks, you know each and every single moving part, and you're not just like hey, the machine's broken, the, you know, the script or whatever is broken, and you don't know what it is that you're supposed to be doing. But ultimately I think, you know, just having that control over the entire system by understanding how it's built from the ground up, you can ultimately have that leverage that transverses through time. And I think that is one of the advantages that ultimately, you know, takes time for sure, but ultimately is unmatched. Because if you can build those systems and those things from the ground up, I think into the future you'll ultimately just have that leverage that no one else has, simply because you've taken the time. And I believe that this is true for now. I believe that this is true, and into the future, that this is how we're basically just going to be shaping the future, that hey, it's going to become more accessible. 100% facts. But also ultimately understanding that the barrier to entry is only going to increase, but these skills are never going to go away. And just ultimately understanding that hey, we're not going to get replaced in this specific aspect, and ultimately through that we understand that hey, if we're not going to get replaced, we can ultimately build these machines. So slight sidetrack, but I think that was very important to just, you know, get a wind off as per se. So ultimately through that also means that we're making sure that hey, cash is cool, but it's not my leverage at the moment. And I've spoken about this, you know, in a previous video, that my most valuable asset isn't money at this point in time. It's how I think, how I speak, and how I navigate ambiguity, of which I spoke about in a previous video, to say one of the most, you know, crucial our leverage points right now is ultimately our mind, how we think, how we build these leverage points, and also understanding ambiguity, and also how we speak. Because I think the proof of thoughts is where I show up daily, basically just building this mode of posting every single day, because it builds that clarity in what it is that we're building, so that we can ultimately understand how to shape the future in the way that we want to shape it, and also use this clarity through logs, by basically logging the decisions and the questions and the way that we're thinking through things. And I think that's going to bring a level of clarity and decision making that's ultimately going to build into the future. And this is back end structure, and this ultimately funnels into the back end structure, where I say hey, the articulation layered into every workflow, basically making sure that each and every articulation, or the way that I'm speaking about certain topics and just sharing different things, and I'm actively just implementing this in terms of the workflows that we have, and also making sure that this is what builds trust, and making sure that this creates asymmetric upside. Also ultimately just making sure that we're creating as much upside as we possibly can, by saying hey, I don't need to prove revenue right now, I need to build repeatable conviction. I need to just make sure that we're actively building that conviction within what it is. Because sure, 100% it's cool to, you know, pump out revenue numbers and things like that, but right now I think this point in time that we are at, we just need to be building, and solely building, and just solely just understanding that means that we need to take a path that is solely just, you know, directed for us, and the clarity and the level of, you know, way of articulation in terms of workflows, how we're basically managing different softwares and all these different things, I think is only just going to come from that. And this clarity is only going to compound into the future. My most humble belief that I know that, hey, this is what we're actively going to be doing into the future, that, hey, we need to make sure that we're just laying a solid foundation, so that into the future, we understand each and every single moving part, by building a new standard. And that's what I'm here for. I want to build a new standard for how African operators scale, how they also, you know, define what backend actually means. Basically saying hey, I need to make sure that I am defining a new standard within what it is that we're doing, in terms of how back end is actually articulated, how it's actually, thought of, and also just creating a new movement and saying, hey, I want to also create a standard for what it means to think 50-year moves, so long-term vision, and not just 30-day sprints. Not saying, hey, this month let's just optimize for 10K, and just ultimately just say, hey, how can we actively just expand the time horizon and understand that this is how we need to look into the future, and just ultimately build that future. Because in as much as it's cool to think about the future and what it's going to look like and things like that, we ultimately just need to make sure that we're hitting the nail in the wall, and are actively building that future, and not just thinking in 30-day sprints, by setting that new standard. And I think through this, we're going to ultimately just gain that level of clarity that is going to allow Killer Chaos OS, our internal operating system, to ultimately get to the level that we want to get to. And also just make sure that, hey, you understand that by taking a different approach, which is basically having that 10K a month mindset, for us specifically, is saying, hey, you can make 10K a month and still be stuck in reactive loops. You can still be stuck in those reactive loops where you just progressively just reacting to certain things that are happening, and just saying, hey, this month we need to do this month we need to do that, and we need to do that. But ultimately, I'm building a system that breaks the loop entirely. How can we actively just expand our time horizon, that we can ultimately break this loop, so that we're not just reacting, but we're actively just having this proactive approach to solving problems, and ultimately understanding that, hey, we can detect certain things that are going on in a business and save them money and generate them value through that, and ultimately say, hey, this is where leverage lies. We need to make sure that we're just actively just creating leverage in every single aspect that we possibly can, and saying, hey, this is the game that I'm actively wanting to play. But ultimately, that relies on focusing on what is next, where I'm going next. And these are the actionable steps of how I'm thinking about moving into the future, which are doubling down on storytelling, not just showing the system, but the story behind it, what it is that we're actively building in Killer Chaos OS, because we want to redefine how chaos is basically structured, how we also just think about these in, those feedback loops as well, and also layering in strategic solitude to architect the long-term vision. Because I think, just having that, solitude is ultimately going to build that big picture vision, that we can ultimately just understand, hey, this is from first principles, that we understand this is true, this is what needs to actually be built, and this is how we're going to build it into the future. And mapping real KPIs beyond revenue. What are the KPIs that I can actively map, that go beyond revenue right now, which is trust, speed, ownership, and predict repeatability, and ultimately understanding that, hey, these are our modes that we can actively just leverage today in order to build the big picture vision, because we know the flip side is going to be way more worth it into the long run than rather just focusing and optimizing on the short-term future. And also just making sure that we're building it right, so that we serve our current customer base correctly, and that we're actively just creating as much value as we possibly can. But with that, it means that we're stacking clarity, we're stacking through equity, through documentation, and that builds the lost moats. So basically making sure that we're actively building that internal documentation, and making sure that documentation is building the moat for the future, and making sure that we're just actively hitting the nail in the wall, and just striving to build Killer Chaos OS into this operating system that is like a second ops brain for the entire business infrastructure, by basically striving to say, hey, this is the main mission, which is to ultimately own that infrastructure layer and ultimately provide as much value as we possibly can. But also, I wrote one final word, which I think this is going to be, basically to sum it up, which is 10K a month is a good milestone, 100%. And I respect a lot of people that, strive for 10K a month. This is just not our sole path that we're taking. I think long-term vision for us as well is what we're actively building for. And I'm not building milestones. I want to, actively just make sure that I'm building a movement rather than milestones. And that's where when the cash, shows up, that it'll be because the machine was ready to print on repeat. Basically saying, hey, we're actively just focusing on the long-term vision of what it is that we're actively building, but because we're not focusing on that, when it does print, it will print, and we'll be able to create as much value as we possibly can into the future. And this is ultimately just going to shape how we think about Killer Chaos OS and how we scale it into the future. But I also just wanted to, just handle like one final word for me, which is the people who build generational companies weren't obsessed with income goals. They were obsessed with impact, leverage, and solving painful problems at scale. And that is the game that I'm playing. So saying, basically, to summarize all of this up, ultimately, right now, if we look back, like I said in the beginning, that hey, these companies, Apple, etc., they built and they optimized for solving big problems. They optimize for leverage, they optimize for impact as well. And how can we actively steal some of those nuggets as well, stealing like an artist, and say, hey, we also just want to understand this. And through understanding this, it also, makes us grounded in the sense that hey, it's okay to take this path, that hey, we're not, focusing too much on this 10, 20K, 30K, 40K a month, thing, that we're actively building the machine for the long run, but into the future, it's going to be worth it. The payoff is going to be worth it. That we're actively just taking the time to solely just understand what it is that we're actively building. And through this, we're building that long-term vision of Killer Chaos OS, where we have this impact, like I mentioned, this $100 million worth of impact, and also just redefining industries, which is basically the leverage part, and solving problems at scale, which we're basically doing through inspiring millions of people. So if you see a lot of commonalities with what it is that I actively say at the end of the videos, of saying, hey, we want to create this massive amount of impact, we want to inspire millions of people, and we also just want to redefine what this specific industry that we're building for. We want to redefine what chaos means, and also understanding it at its core. And I know that through this, we're going to make lots of mistakes, 100%. We wish we had all the answers, but unfortunately we don't, and that's okay. But ultimately, we're just going to hit the nail in the wall and solely just use these as our mental modes to basically build better and scale better into the future by making lots of mistakes, because we're just gathering data points at this point in time. R&D for, basically R&D for free, and also just, just making sure that each and every single day we're hitting the nail in the wall, and that we're actively just building the future to create this massive impact to ultimately inspire millions of people, and ultimately redefine industries, and also just build the big picture vision for Killer Chaos OS. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram. If you guys have any questions, just make sure to pop them in the comments, and I will see you guys in the next video.